Right now there's something on your feet. Maybe sneakers, maybe slippers, maybe nothing at all, because you're at home. But at some point today you probably put on a piece of technology so old, so universal, that we've stopped thinking of it as technology at all. We just call it a shoe. And here's the question nobody asks. Why do humans wear them? Not when were shoes invented, though we'll get to that. The real question is stranger, because for most of human history, and for most of the animal kingdom even today, feet touch the ground bare. No other species on Earth wraps its feet in dead cow skin, woven grass, or foam and rubber before it walks. We are the only animal that decided its own feet were not good enough for the world it lived in. So what happened? What was so dangerous, so painful, or so urgent that an entire species changed the way it walked? The answer takes us through frozen tundras, disease-ridden swamps, ancient bones bent out of shape, and a discovery scientists only confirmed a few years ago using something you would never expect: the size of our toes. Let's start with what we actually know for certain, which is less than you'd think. For a long time, historians simply looked at cave paintings and old leather scraps and guessed. The oldest surviving shoes, sagebrush bark sandals found in a cave in Oregon, are about 10,000 years old. Leather moccasin-style shoes found in Armenia date back roughly 5,500 years. These are remarkable finds, but they're not answers. A shoe found in a cave tells you that shoes existed. It doesn't tell you why humans needed them in the first place, or when the very first pair was ever laced up. Because shoes have a cruel problem for archaeology. They rot. Leather, plant fiber, woven bark, all of it decomposes within a few centuries in most climates. Stone tools survive for 1,000,000 years. Shoes barely survive 10,000. Which means for the vast majority of the time humans have existed, roughly 300,000 years, we have almost no physical evidence of what, if anything, was on their feet. So how do you study something that no longer exists? You stop looking at the shoe. You start looking at the foot. This is where the story gets genuinely clever. In the early 2000s, a team of researchers led by anthropologist Eric Trinkos started asking a very specific question about human toe bones. When you walk barefoot, your smaller toes, the second through fifth ones, work hard. They grip the ground, they curl slightly with each step, they help you balance and push off. Over a lifetime, that constant gripping actually shapes the bone. Barefoot toes tend to be thicker and more robust, especially compared to the big toe. But when you wear a stiff-soled shoe, something changes. The sole does the gripping job for you. Your small toes stop working as hard, and over enough time, they get measurably thinner and weaker relative to the big toe, which still bears most of your weight regardless of footwear. Trinkos realized this meant something remarkable. If you found ancient human skeletons and measured the ratio between the big toe bone and the smaller toe bones, you could actually tell whether that person had spent their life walking barefoot or wearing shoes. The bones themselves would carry the memory. So his team went looking through the fossil record. And what they found pushed the shoe-wearing timeline back much further than any surviving sandal ever could. Skeletons from around 40,000 years ago in places like the Middle East and Europe showed the telltale thinning of the smaller toes, exactly the pattern you'd expect from regular long-term footwear use. Older skeletons, going back further into the Ice Ages, did not show this pattern. Their toes looked fully barefoot, robust and thick across all 5 digits. That 40,000-year mark isn't a coincidence. It lines up almost exactly with something else happening in human history at the time. Modern humans were pushing hard into some of the coldest environments they had ever tried to survive in: Ice Age Europe and Northern Asia. Places where the ground itself, for months at a stretch, was a weapon. And this is where the real answer to our question starts to take shape. Shoes probably weren't invented for comfort. They weren't invented for style, for status, or even primarily for protection from sharp rocks. The leading theory, and the one the toe bone evidence supports, is that shoes were survival equipment against cold. Frostbite is a brutal, fast enemy. Exposed skin can start to freeze in under 30 minutes in extreme cold, and feet are especially vulnerable because they're far from the body's core and get comparatively little blood flow when the body starts prioritizing vital organs. A hunter-gatherer who lost toes to frostbite in an Ice Age winter wasn't just injured. They were often as good as dead. You cannot run from a predator, chase prey, or migrate hundreds of miles a season on ruined feet. So somewhere around 40,000 years ago, in the freezing margins of Ice Age Eurasia, someone almost certainly wrapped an animal hide around their foot out of desperation. And it worked. And they told someone else. And that simple, disposable idea, hide wrapped and tied with sinew, became one of the most quietly important inventions in human history, right up there with fire and the needle. Speaking of needles, there's a second piece of evidence that fits perfectly into this puzzle. Around the same window of time, we see a sudden spike in the archaeological record of eyed sewing needles, tiny bone and ivory needles with a hole for thread, appearing across Siberia and Europe. Before this period, humans mostly draped animal skins over themselves. After it, they were tailoring, cutting hides into shapes and sewing them into fitted garments. And fitted garments, unlike a draped hide, actually work on feet. You cannot drape a foot in a flat piece of leather and expect it to survive a 20-mile winter trek. You need to shape it, wrap it, and stitch it closed. The needle and the shoe likely arrived as a package deal, born from the same freezing necessity. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because cold wasn't the only threat waking humans up to the value of covered feet. Thousands of years later, in a completely different environment, another pressure was pushing in the same direction: disease and injury from the ground itself. Ancient agricultural societies in the Near East and the Mediterranean were now living in dense, permanent settlements, surrounded by mud, animal waste, sharp debris, and parasites that could enter through the skin on the soles of the feet. Hookworm, for example, is a parasite that infects its host by burrowing directly through bare skin, touching contaminated soil. In these growing farming communities, a simple sandal wasn't just comfort. It was a barrier between your bloodstream and a swamp full of things trying to get into it. This is likely why we see sandals, rather than closed boots, becoming the dominant shoe style in warmer ancient civilizations: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. The threat wasn't the cold anymore. It was the ground itself: sharp reeds, hot sand, disease-laden mud, and rough terrain during long trade journeys. Egyptian sandals made from papyrus and palm leaves date back over 4,000 years. And interestingly, in ancient Egypt, footwear quickly became tangled up with status. Pharaohs and nobles wore elaborate sandals decorated with gold, while laborers often still went barefoot. The same object that started as pure survival gear in the Ice Age had, within a few thousand years, become a symbol of who you were in society. That pattern, survival tool quietly turning into status symbol, is something you can trace all the way to today. Roman soldiers wore the caliga, a heavy military sandal with metal studs on the sole, engineered specifically so legions could march thousands of miles across the empire without their feet falling apart. That's not fashion. That's ancient military-grade equipment, and historians consider it one of the quiet reasons Rome could project power as far as it did. An army that can walk further than its enemies, without crippling foot injuries, has an enormous logistical advantage most people never think about. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, shoes swung hard back into the symbol category. Extremely long, pointed shoes called poulaines became fashionable among the wealthy, some with toes so exaggerated they had to be stuffed with material or tied up to the wearer's knee just to walk in them. They were, functionally, terrible shoes, but they broadcast something no ordinary laborer's foot could afford to say: I do not need to walk through mud, fields, or workshops today. There's also a quieter, more medical thread running through this whole story, one that most people never connect to footwear at all. The human foot itself was never designed by evolution to be permanently enclosed. It was designed to be bare, to spread, to grip, to feel the ground and adjust instantly to it. The moment we started wrapping it in leather and later rubber, we introduced an entirely new relationship between our bodies and our environment, one where a piece of dead material now sat between our nerve endings and the world. Podiatrists today still study how lifelong shoe wearing changes arch development, toe spacing, and even gait, compared with populations that grow up walking barefoot or in minimal footwear. Some research on populations in rural India and Africa who spend much of their lives barefoot has found wider, stronger, more naturally arched feet than in populations that wear structured shoes from early childhood. None of this means shoes were a mistake. It means every solution carries a trade-off, and humans have been quietly negotiating that trade-off for 40,000 years, without most of us ever noticing. The industrial era only accelerated this negotiation. Before the 1800s, shoes were made almost entirely by hand, one cobbler, one last, one pair at a time, which meant most ordinary people owned very few shoes and repaired them for years rather than replacing them. The invention of the sewing machine adapted for leather, and later the rise of factory shoe production in cities like Northampton in England and Lynn in Massachusetts changed footwear from a scarce, custom-made good into something that could be mass-produced, standardized by size, and sold cheaply to millions of people at once. For the first time in human history, owning multiple pairs of shoes for different purposes, work, formal occasions, sport, became normal rather than something reserved only for the wealthy. That shift, from scarcity to abundance, quietly reshaped economies, created entire industries, and eventually gave rise to the enormous global footwear market that exists today, one where a single popular sneaker release can generate more attention and money than most countries' entire annual shoe production once did in a century. And that abundance changed our relationship with shoes yet again. When something is scarce, like it was for most of human history, you wear it because you must. When something becomes abundant, you start wearing it because you want to, because it says something, because it fits an identity you're building. That's the real difference between a caveman's frostbite-preventing hide wrap and a wall of sneaker boxes in a modern store. The underlying object is descended from the same idea. The reason we reach for it has completely changed. So by the time we reach the modern era, footwear has already lived at least two separate lives. It began, 40,000 years ago, as a piece of emergency survival technology against frostbite. Then it became protection against disease and rough terrain in early farming societies. And somewhere along the way, it also became one of the clearest visual markers of wealth and class a human being could wear, sometimes even at the cost of actually being able to walk properly. And that tension, protection versus display, is still baked into every shoe on the planet today. Steel-toe boots on a construction site exist for the exact same core reason a caveman wrapped hide around his foot in an Ice Age winter. Because the ground is dangerous and feet are vulnerable. Meanwhile, a limited edition sneaker that costs more than a month's rent exists for almost the opposite reason. Not to protect the foot at all, but to say something about the person wearing it, in the same spirit as a pharaoh's gold sandal or a nobleman's absurdly pointed shoe. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why do humans wear shoes when no other animal on Earth needs to? Because we are the species that left the warm climates our bodies were built for and pushed into ice ages, swamps, deserts, and cities built on stone and metal. Every other animal either stayed within the environment its body could handle or evolved paws, hooves, or fur to handle it. Humans didn't wait for evolution. We invented our way out of the problem instead, wrapping our most vulnerable, least protected body part in whatever material would keep it alive long enough to walk another day. Bare feet were built for African savannas. They were never built for glaciers, battlefields, factory floors, or 8-hour shifts on concrete. So instead of waiting thousands of generations for our bodies to catch up, we built a second skin for our feet and carried it with us into every environment on the planet. The shoe on your foot right now, whatever it is, sits at the end of a 40,000-year chain that started with someone freezing, desperate, and out of options in an Ice Age winter, wrapping a piece of dead animal skin around their foot because the alternative was losing it. Everything since then, sandals, boots, stilettos, sneakers, has just been humanity refining that one original, cold, and quietly brilliant idea.